Story 1. Personally, I once had a headache so severe I contemplated ending my life when nothing else helped. Sound, light, and movement were agony. I just lay there suffering until it ran its course. I slept for 2 days afterward. Story 2. I developed gallstones after having a baby. Childbirth was a walk in the park compared to them. Story 3. I had a bone marrow biopsy. For those who do not know, it is a procedure in which a large needle the size of a fork prong is inserted through the bone to extract bone marrow for monitoring different types of cancer. It is not pleasant, especially when a toddler must undergo it multiple times. Maybe it is different 30 years later or with adults, but when I was a child the most they could do for pain was numb the skin, which made little difference because the pain of having a hole in the bone is far worse than a typical needle injection. Story 4. Teeth. It is absurd that dental care is not considered health care in the United States. Story 5. I was severely mauled by a dog, but that was not the worst pain. Surprisingly, cleaning out the wounds in the emergency room was even worse. Story 6. A prolapsed disc severed my sciatic nerve. At the time, I genuinely wished for death. They gave me morphine, but I was still writhing in pain. It took major surgery and 6 months to learn to walk again. Story 7. Severe necrotizing pancreatitis. I could not take a full breath because of the pain. It felt like I had been stabbed by a lightsaber that remained inside me. It caused severe vomiting and an inability to keep food down, along with profound diarrhea. I lost 50 pounds in 1 month. 20% of my pancreas was destroyed, and I developed type 3C diabetes and gastroparesis. Story 8. I broke my tibia, the thick leg bone, cleanly in half a year ago. I was sobbing and screaming. Story 9. 11 years ago, I had a motorcycle accident on the freeway. My left ankle and right hip socket were shattered. I could not feel or move my legs at first, but the pain when the paramedics lifted me onto a gurney was the worst pain I had ever felt. It was like they had stuck steak knives into my pelvis and twisted as they lifted me. I later learned my right femur had been completely dislocated from my hip at that time. I had to relearn how to walk. Story 10. Worst. Sciatic nerve pain from a herniated disc. Second worst. Abscess tooth. Story 11. I promise I am not exaggerating any of this. My mother thought I could sleep through the pain without any medication right after my wisdom teeth were removed. I woke up in so much pain I contemplated cutting my jaw off with a knife because that sounded less painful than what I was feeling. I remember telling myself the pain would not last much longer and that I would be without a jaw for the rest of my life if I did it. Story 12. In the exact order of pain. Calcified nerve channels. Heart attack. Dislocated thumb. The Boston Red Sox blowing the 1986 World Series. Story 13. A herniated disc is especially concerning because there is number 100% cure. Story 14. The third greatest physical pain of my life was when I herniated a disc in my spine. The second was when I herniated a disc again. The greatest, by a huge margin, was when I herniated a disc for a third time. By the 9th time, I would have given anything to return to the pain of the second. Story 15. I developed gout yesterday and am still on medication. This is my 3rd time in 3 years and it always happens in winter. Getting old can suck. Story 16. I got boiling oil on my skin and watched it slowly change as it burned every nerve ending. I'm still afraid to use oil because of that. Story 17. I yawned once on a casual Tuesday and popped my jaw. Felt like Mike Tyson had just hooked me. It took about 6 months before I could chew properly again, and about a year before I was no longer afraid to yawn in case it happened again. Story 18. Laser-assisted in situ keratomileusis. The painkillers I received afterward did not work. I spent the whole night with a feeling I can only describe as molten glass in my eyes. I do not recommend it. The operation was still worth it. Story 19. Almost the worst. Polycystic ovary syndrome cramps. One cycle started while I was at work, and I was very close to asking them to call an ambulance for me. The actual worst was an endometrial biopsy while I was fully awake with no medication or mental preparation because the doctor said they could take me to the operating room and sedate me next week. But that would be a lot for something that takes a minute and they could do it right there. I called my sister and sobbed for the entire 45-minute ride home. Story 20. Migraine. I suffer from it a lot, and every time I wonder if it is worth living with this pain. Because of migraine, I learned how to make myself vomit, because sometimes that is the only way the pain becomes bearable enough to fall asleep. Knowing some migraine triggers, I can no longer go to a club, a concert, or even a cinema. I am sorry you are experiencing such severe pain and that it has led you to make yourself vomit. If you are thinking it is not worth living or are in immediate danger, please contact local emergency services now. If you are in the United States, you can call or text 988 to reach the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. Would you like me to help you find support or resources where you are? Story 21. I was passing a kidney stone. While walking, it suddenly dropped me to my knees. Story 22. Acute diverticulitis with gas entrapment. It is much worse than a broken bone and can last for days to weeks. During one emergency room visit, the receiving staff said I was so visibly in pain that they gave me a full dose of Dilaudid in the intake area. Story 23. Spinal gout. Yes, in rare instances gout can manifest in the spine. I experienced it once before I started allopurinol. It was excruciating. I could not move without pain. Thankfully, after starting allopurinol, I have not had any attacks for years. That episode lasted 3 days of almost constant, scorching, radiating pain, even while lying on a heated mat on the basement floor. Story 24. When I was in about 6th or 7th grade, I got sick after school and went to my grandparents' house because my parents were working. I took a nap, and when I woke up, I suddenly began vomiting and could not use my legs. I tried to stand and fell immediately. My dad and my brother rushed me to the hospital, where I learned I had contracted meningitis for the second time. It turned out that the tissue that kept my brain stable had been deteriorating, and my brain was pressing on my left eardrum. I'm not a doctor. This is what I was told later. They performed surgery, scraped bone from around my right ear, and used it to reconstruct the left side. When I woke up from surgery, I was in intense pain. My legs felt broken. I screamed, cursed the medical staff and my mother, and had to be sedated because I became violent. A few days later, I had to go through physical therapy to relearn how to walk. That was the second most painful experience I've had. I nearly quit physical therapy and decided I would stay in a chair until my dad said he knew I was too strong to give up. I pushed through it. Story 25. Necrotizing pancreatitis felt like a chestburster alien was going to emerge from my stomach. I sat in immense pain for hours. The surgeon finally came to see me, felt my abdomen, and said we needed to take me to surgery immediately. Had he wheeled me outside into a back alley and shot me, I would have been just as okay with it. I ended up in the hospital for about 100 days. I had only a small chance of surviving the operation, and I beat the odds. The pain was 11 out of 10. Story 26. Waking during surgery, I told the surgeon and the anesthesiologist that I am here. The anesthesiologist said, "Okay, I will give you a little more." He did. It paralyzed me and did not render me unconscious. I could not tell them I was still there and felt every cut and suture. Story 27. Endometriosis and intrauterine device insertion, followed by migraines, sinus pressure, toothaches, earaches, and a tonsillectomy. Story 28. Coronavirus disease 2019 was so horrific to me. This would be a runner-up. My body felt broken. I felt every organ. Story 29. When I was a child, the dentist seemed to perform the extraction with little or no anesthesia, and I screamed as if I were being murdered. Story 30. Once, when I was about 14 years old, I vomited some of the mucous membrane lining of my stomach, and my stomach began to digest itself. The pain was awful. I could barely crawl to my mother's car and then to the emergency room. The good news is that one injection fixed me, and I did not develop an ulcer. Story 31. An ear infection led to trigeminal neuralgia that lasted 3 months while I waited to see a specialist. Doctors would not prescribe pain or nerve medications or take my pain concerns seriously. The pain radiated to my jaw, head, neck, and down my arms. Tattoo removal was also very painful. It was not only the initial pinprick but also the burning and blisters that persisted for days afterward. Story 32. Root canal treatment without anesthesia performed by a very bad dentist. Story 33. I sliced most of the pad off my index finger an hour ago. Right now it's pretty bad. Story 34. Endometriosis pain. The pain and heavy bleeding began a year after my first period. I started my period at 10, and the pain began when I was 11. By 15, I was vomiting and fainting. It ruined my teenage and young adult years. I was homeschooled for middle and high school because of this and for other reasons. I could not move out for college. I was finally diagnosed at age 20 after being dismissed by 2 different doctors as an overdramatic teenager who would grow out of it. I tried the birth control pill twice, once at 15 and again at 20, and both times I experienced horrific side effects. I had an intrauterine device inserted and it helps a lot. I am 22 now and still have a great deal of pain during my period, but it is nothing like it was. Story 35. I had a double compound fracture in my wrist. The pain was not immediate. I sat joking with pale bystanders as we waited for the ambulance. I cried a little when my friend found me walking past at that moment, but that was from something else. Not pain. During a ketamine-induced trip, they pushed the bones back inside, and a student nurse wrapped it very poorly and so tightly that it felt like my arm was going to burst from the pressure of the cast. They refused to remove it until I stood up and threatened to cut it off myself with a pair of scissors. I could not accept no for an answer. The pain was intolerable. Ketamine was fun, though. Story 36. My arm was badly broken, to the point where I could have lost my hand. This was also when I found out I am resistant to opiates. Intravenous fentanyl relieved my shock but did nothing for the pain and produced no euphoria. I had suspected this before and that confirmed it. Before that, I had a massive cramp in both buttocks. I fell to the floor and writhed in agony for about 5 minutes, though it felt like an hour. I could not even yell. It was so painful. I just lay silently over my injured buttocks. Story 37. When I was a child, a hammock snapped and I landed on a root. I think I broke my tailbone. It was sore for weeks. Story 38. I have an anal fissure with hemorrhoids. I am 31 and have been in pain almost every day for 7 to 8 years. I just had surgery to fix it since I finally have insurance, but it was a month ago and nothing has changed. That pain will literally change you. Story 39. 6 months after a particularly nasty bicycle motocross accident in which my handlebars impaled me under my ribs and punctured my pericardium, the sac around my heart, I was constantly out of breath and lethargic. I went back to the hospital and was found to have a large amount of fluid on my lungs and an enlarged heart. What had happened was that my handlebars had nicked my heart and it had not healed. Every beat of my heart squeezed out a tiny amount of blood, which was caught by my pericardium, and it started filling with fluid. The doctor inserted a tube or stent into my pericardium to drain the old blood. It was done under local anesthetic, and a stitch or 2 held it in place. The doctor decided it was a touch too far and pulled it out a few centimeters. It felt like he was pulling my heart out of my chest and my soul out of my body at the same time. 0 out of 10 would not recommend. Story 40. I had a strangulated abdominal hernia twice. The first time was on my honeymoon. We went to the emergency room. They were able to manipulate it back into my abdomen. Insurance did not approve surgery because it was no longer considered life-threatening. The second time, 2 months later, at the height of the coronavirus disease 2019 pandemic, we drove 30 minutes with me lying flat in the back seat while my wife drove in a panic. She was not allowed into the emergency room and had to wait in the car for news. I spent an hour sitting in a wheelchair waiting to be seen, moaning in pain. The intake nurse assumed I was seeking medication. I was placed behind a curtain because no exam rooms were available due to decontamination protocol delays. I begged the nurse to let me lie flat, even on the floor. The next few hours were a blur of agony. Eventually, I was taken to emergency surgery. I lost just under a foot of intestine due to necrosis, but I did not develop sepsis. I spent a week in the hospital and did not get back on my feet until a month later. I almost had to drop out of my master's program. It was the worst pain I had ever experienced. It could all have been avoided if insurance had not classified the repair as elective. Story 41. When I was stabbed, I felt physical and emotional pain at the same time. Story 42. On Halloween, I dressed as Ghostface and tied the bottom half of the costume to my waist with a large rubber band. Came undone while I was riding my bike. I fell on my face, slid, and my nose started bleeding immediately after the first impact. My mouth still hurts because my tooth jammed into my lip and cut it. Do not try to do anything risky for Halloween. Story 43. My foot was pointing the wrong way after a skateboarding injury. It did not hurt much at first, then it suddenly hurt a lot. Fortunately, that happened when the ambulance arrived and I received a dose of morphine. I found it funny that I was calm as a cucumber, giving orders to people to call for help and arrange care for my children until my mother could come to my house. I was at a skate park with them and I did not want to scare them, so I stayed calm. The pain in the ambulance and every bump in the road was excruciating until the morphine brought relief. Story 44. I had a tibial plateau fracture. Every time my leg was jostled the wrong way, I screamed uncontrollably with pain. I had never before experienced a scream from the depths of my soul in response to pain. It shocked me. Story 45. My ankle was dislocated when someone fell on me. I felt it come out and then pop back into place as I fell. I could not stop screaming. Story 46. I shattered my patella into 13 pieces. All the pain from the injury and the subsequent muscle atrophy and rebuilding has been treacherous. The runner-up is getting 12 shots of anesthetic through the roof of my mouth. Story 47. Back pain, lumbar sciatica, and a herniated disc with inflammation so severe that it prevents you from walking or moving. Story 48. While we're on this subject, does anyone know why, of all things, nail beds have so many more nerve endings than they need? I mean, a tiny tuft of rogue nail down the side and bam, your finger turns beet red and throbs like a bastard. I'd vote this as the number one thing that shouldn't hurt as much as it does. It is guaranteed to make you feel like a twat and elicit zero sympathy. Probably quite rightly. It is only a nail. What part of this don't those nails understand? Story 49. People are saying pneumonia and toothaches. Oh my God. I am a 30-year-old woman and I had my first root canal at 12, fully awake and conscious, and was given acetaminophen instead of hydrocodone because my mother thought I would become addicted. I had pneumonia when I was 21 while my wisdom teeth were still in. I am getting the rest removed soon. The one removed last year caused me severe pain, crying, and panic. Nothing was worse than the abortion I had to have. Since high school, people described abortion as a rite of passage or an obvious solution to avoid a permanent decision, but it was the most severe. I thought I was going to die. Pain I have ever felt, and I would never wish it on anyone. Story 50. My heart broke when I lost my two dogs that I had for 12 and 13 years. It was a different kind of pain, I know, compared to others. Story 51. I had a catheter inserted by a nurse who, if her job does not work out, will always have a job at Helga's House of Pain. Story 52. I had pancreatitis. The strong opioid medications I was given could not reduce the pain. It was overwhelming agony. Story 53. 1. Gallstones. My first attack occurred after my third child was born. 6 months later, and after more than 80 episodes, I was allowed to schedule removal of my gallbladder. 2. I had a kidney stone after my first child was born. 3. My water broke naturally and contractions progressed quickly. The epidural failed during the delivery of my fourth child, which I did not want to experience. 4. An infected tooth developed because the dentist did not clean it properly before sealing. It became an emergency root canal after I woke up with my jaw swollen as if a softball were growing out of it. Story 54. Pancreatitis. They tried every opioid they had to stop the pain. The pain was overwhelming. I knew nothing except pain. I could not speak rationally. Story 55. Having a cyst lanced near my anus is right up there. Story 56. Anything that affects breathing through my nose and causes sinus pressure. It has happened 3 times now. The first time I had coronavirus disease 2019, once when I was 9 months pregnant, and during my first sinus infection last year. It feels like my entire body is shutting down and my nervous system is on fire. I went to the emergency room all 3 times. Story 57. A hockey ball hit the tip of my penis, causing bleeding that led to an emergency room visit and nearly required circumcision. After that, I bought the best jockstrap money could buy. Story 58. The greatest physical pain I've ever felt was a high fever that left my whole body aching and weak. Story 59. I was kicked in the balls and I definitely never want it to happen again. Story 60. When my nose was broken, it felt like 100 searing hot needles coated in pop rocks being jammed up my sinuses. I would not recommend it. Story 61. Charlie horse made my whole body lock up. I take any pain any day over a toothache. Story 62. Hip surgery. I broke my hip a few years ago, and the recovery was worse than the break itself. Story 63. I used to be picked last for tag football before school by the cool kids team. Then a new kid took my spot, and I became the last person picked. Every bone in my body still hurts. Story 64. Bowel obstruction, kidney stone, and dry socket are all tied for first. Story 65. Childbirth was painful to watch. It was hard to see my wife go through it. Story 66. I was injured when I was 7 years old. I wound up with such severe lower back pain that I could not walk for several weeks. It was the worst pain I have ever experienced. Story 67. The last time I had cramps, my body expelled a lot of disgusting material. The worst part was that I could not predict when it would end or what to expect. I sat in the bathroom with a headache, repeatedly wondering whether it was over, with pain that made me feel I might vomit, but I did not. At the same time, I wanted to lie down, but I was afraid something unsavory would come from my mouth or elsewhere. Story 68. Contractions during labor, a toothache, and migraines. Story 69. Clostridioides difficile can cause abdominal cramps. Avoid using public restrooms in hospitals and nursing homes. Powerful toilet flushes can spread bacteria, and people can have it on their hands, so sinks and doorknobs are places where you can pick up Clostridioides difficile. Story 70. When my heart was intentionally stopped using adenosine, the doctor said it would feel like a truck hitting me. It did. Story 71. I dislocated my right knee. I was in so much pain that I nearly fainted. Story 72. Drug-free childbirth. I remember the ring of fire and thought how accurate it was, which was comforting but no less painful. It was all just too much. Pain, pressure, fear, and adrenaline. Story 73. My hernia repair was botched last month. I had the hernia for over a year until it strangulated part of my intestine, which began to die. They removed the dying tissue and explained that I had started hemorrhaging. According to the surgeons, because of the bleeding they had to act quickly, and they completely severed my pudendal nerve, which runs between the legs and controls sensation and movement in the genitals. This caused complete paralysis of half of my genitals. I can feel the left side somewhat, but I cannot feel the right side. It is a very strange sensation. I wish I could go back and keep the hernia. Long story short, it was easily the worst pain I have ever experienced. I do not trust doctors. Story 74. Dying kinda comes to mind for me. I almost bled to death. Story 75. Full belt of shingles. I wedged myself into our recliner, propped up with pillows, so I could not move for 2 weeks. Any slight movement felt like I was being stabbed with multiple knives. Story 76. Hernia complications following appendectomy. This was before it became the super simplified procedure it is today. Story 77. I have torn a few ligaments and muscles. That was the most painful experience I have had. Once, I had an infected boil on my knee and had to go to the accident and emergency department. It was lanced without any pain relief. Story 78. When my ear doctor stuck a needle through my eardrum to make a hole for a drainage tube, and then inserted the tube, either he did not use enough local anesthetic, or he did not wait long enough for it to take effect. The pain was unbelievably intense. Before that, the worst pain I had felt was when I passed a gallstone. That was bad, but not nearly as bad as the eardrum piercing. Story 79. Belly button hernia surgery was performed by hand, not laparoscopic. I could barely move for almost 3 days. Story 80. Perhaps when I burned my leg last year, the pain was atrocious. Story 81. A burst fracture of the fourth lumbar vertebra with 70% vertebral height loss and retropulsion. That was very painful. Natural childbirth was a close second. Story 82. A golf ball-sized cyst on my scrotum became infected and grew to the size of a baseball by the time I got to the emergency room. The whole thing grew in 2 days. Story 83. Broken collarbone. Worse than that was the devil's itch from a sunburn. Story 84. The day after surgery to repair my shattered bones and have 2 plates and 18 screws inserted, I had a Charlie horse in my leg. Story 85. I had a 10 mm kidney stone and required 2 injections of morphine to relieve the pain. Story 86. A few years ago, I ate some curry goat. When I say some, I mean 2 platefuls with rice and peas because it was so good. The next day, I had a bowel movement and was constipated on top of everything. I never gave birth, but holy shit, this was unholy how it came out of me. I was sweating and crying. I threw up at one point and blacked out from the pain. My husband almost called an ambulance because he was convinced I had torn my anus or something. The pain was in my pelvis and back and hurt 100 times more than a period. I had cancer treatment this past year. Of all the procedures and surgeries, nothing will top that Jamaican super bowel that went through me. Story 87. A spinal headache is worse than any of the 4 kidney stones I've had. Story 88. Appendicitis. Goddamn. I was 9. I threw up about 6 times and was taken to the hospital. I couldn't lie down without pain, and I couldn't breathe without a mild ache. After they removed my appendix, I was exhausted and slept for 19 hours. Story 89. I don't know. I feel like I try to pretend it never happened and block it out afterward. I had my bladder ripped during childbirth. I flipped over on an all-terrain vehicle in the mountains of Vermont. I broke fingers and toes, and I had open wounds with stitches from stepping on a nail when I was a kid. My grandfather, a D-Day veteran, yelled at me worse, I think, and hornets went through my and my sister's clothes when we were fishing in a ditch. He yelled at me again. Even worse. I was in a car accident. I just block that out when it is over. Story 90. I had an ear infection and the doctor had to puncture my eardrum. Even though they administered a local anesthetic, it felt like someone was shoving a hot poker into my skull. Thankfully, the pain was relatively short but very intense. 0 out of 10. I would not recommend this. Story 91. My firstborn was 2 weeks late, and I was induced. She weighed 9 pounds. I went from no contractions to strong contractions every 10 minutes within half an hour. She had turned and was trying to come out shoulder first. It felt like someone was trying to tear my spine out through my back. I remember nothing but pain and making a noise like a wounded bull. My husband walked in. He had been sent home because we did not think the induction had worked. He said it looked like a war zone hospital with blood everywhere. They had to perform an emergency cesarean section. I was out of commission for weeks. She was, and still is, perfect. 13 years later, she is taller than me, funny as hell, and happily hoarding my toiletries in her room. Story 92. I understood that the body also holds what the soul keeps silent. The strongest physical pain I experienced came after an emotional loss. Story 93. A spider bite. When 2 Vicodin taken like clockwork every 4 hours did not even slightly change the pain level, I could not even allow my leg to touch the hospital bed, let alone put a sock on that foot or set the leg down on the bed. Despite my normally very high pain tolerance, I was almost in hysterics from the pain. A heavy-duty injection barely allowed me to keep it together. I was not able to confirm whether it was a hobo spider or a widow spider. Both had been found in places in my normal routine. It was terrifying. When I say I have a seriously high pain tolerance, I mean it. At that time, I was pregnant with my 3rd child. I had delivered 2 prior children without painkillers, as well as that child and a later one. I have multiple chronic medical issues that cause some serious pain. None of it comes anywhere near that one particular night with that spider bite. Story 94. I had an abscess between my teeth that spread into my sinus. I tried to pull the tooth and passed out. Being poor is difficult. Story 95. Any pain from the neck up is significantly worse than injuries to other parts of my body. Story 96. I broke my arm, and the doctor put the bones back in their correct position. However, she did not see that both bones were broken and ignored the other fracture. I received no pain relief and passed out 3 times. Story 97. I had a pinched nerve in my lower back. The pain was so severe it was paralyzing. Story 98. When I broke my ankle last March, the pain of it rolling back into place nearly made me pass out. Story 99. A camera was inserted into my penis to check that it wasn't something worse. Turned out to be kidney stones. Story 100. Diabetic ketoacidosis and the kidney pain that accompanied it as the kidneys tried to shut down. Story 101. Not me, but a man I know had such an incredible headache that he lost 10 kilograms in a week. Story 102. Association between passing a kidney stone without painkillers and toothache. Story 103. Bowel obstruction. I have Crohn's disease and have had several. Toothache. Story 104. I had a giant infected cyst on my back removed. They tried to numb it first, but I still felt the knife and the searing pain was significantly worse than childbirth. I screamed so loudly that everyone on the floor could hear. When I left the hospital, I collapsed outside and could not stop shaking. I had to call my mom. I am 37. Story 105. After a lithotripsy, I experienced the worst pain of my life. I have had pain before and several surgeries, but this episode left me asking for pain medication for hours. Then the pain just stopped suddenly after about 8 hours. It was very strange. It did not fade, it simply stopped. A lithotripsy uses sound waves to break up a kidney stone and is sometimes used for other conditions as a safer alternative to open surgery. I really think the nurse thought I was seeking drugs. Honestly, I would have taken anything, no questions asked. Story 106. Toothache. I had a dead tooth and the pain it caused had me taking codeine, the strongest over-the-counter medication I could get. It did not completely remove the pain, it only made it bearable. One early morning I took a drink of ice-cold water and, without thinking, swirled it around my mouth. The pain was indescribable. It bypassed the medication and I had to stand in the kitchen in silent agony, so as not to wake anyone and wait until the temperature in my mouth returned to normal. I have never experienced anything like it. Story 107. I snapped my wrist. The bone nearly protruded through the skin and was partially separated. Story 108. A pilonidal cyst was horrible. A heart attack was just as bad. I was in and out of consciousness. Story 109. I melted an army man for fun, set his gun on fire, and it dripped onto my skin. To this day, it is the worst thing I can remember. Story 110. I used to clean roofs with sodium hypochlorite, which is essentially very strong bleach. At the end of a job, I accidentally soaked my left side with it. You were supposed to wash it off immediately if it gets on your skin, but it was 100 degrees, I was almost finished, and I did not feel like getting off the roof. I finished the job, packed up, and by the time I was driving home my skin was on fire. It started as a black injury that looked like a rug burn and then turned into full-blown third-degree burns. The pain was excruciating throughout the entire healing process. That was 6 years ago and I am still badly scarred. I have broken bones and torn ligaments and tendons, but this was by far the worst physical pain I have ever felt. Remembering it makes me cringe even as I type. Story 111. My appendix was about to explode. Doctors estimated I had about an hour or so from the start of the surgery. That really hurt. Story 112. I have had several. A dying nerve in a tooth ranks high. There was no relief. A severe grease burn affected 15 to 20% of my lower leg. Severe urinary tract infections were awful. I had an abscess tooth. For me, the tooth pain is the worst. It is literally in your head. I pray I never have to endure kidney stones. Story 113. My miscarriage. Early term, heartbeat at the 8-week appointment, miscarried just a few days before the appointment scheduled for the 13-week visit. I had read and heard about miscarriages from everyone in my life, They said it was like labor cramps at worst but manageable. Mine was not like that. I had two births, one ending in an emergency cesarean section and one without an epidural. The miscarriage was still worse. Felt like my body was trying to speedrun labor to evacuate everything. The contractions were so bad I could not walk or breathe. I was writhing on my bed. I was also hemorrhaging, so I went to the emergency room. They gave me Dilaudid, and I could still feel the pain so strong it took my breath away. That pain will haunt me forever. I thought I might be dying. Story 114. In 2018, in my second year of gardening, I was clearing fallen, rotted, hollow logs from my property. I moved them to a limb pile, but when I went to lift the last log, I had not checked my form properly. The log was still solid and I injured my back. Felt like a knife in my lower back. I collapsed to the ground and could not move. I crawled from my backyard to my front porch, where I lay for nearly 2 hours before using my arms to pull myself up. Once inside, I lay on the floor until a family member came home. I missed a week of work and could barely walk. 7 years later, I still have flare-ups in that area. At almost 40, I have difficulty sitting, standing, or lying down because of it. As a teenager, I had sudden severe pain in my left knee. I do not know if it was growing pains, but for 3 days I was confined to a chair with my legs straight. Felt like my kneecap was being pried up. In 2018, when I reached for something, a dagger-like pain shot through my torso under the right side of my ribcage. I dropped what I was reaching for and clutched my side. I became sweaty and exhausted. Over time, I have concluded it was my gallbladder because the area has only worsened. I need to have it removed, but, as with other instances I have mentioned, I am afraid of the cost. In winter 2022, I had cellulitis in my leg. It swelled so much that I could not bend it. It required an expensive emergency room visit. The doctor said that if I had waited another day, the infection might have entered my lymphatic system. Story 115. This is from a transgender person, male to female. Twisted and infected testicles are the worst I can imagine. Feels like a burning, very tight sensation at worst. Other times it is a throbbing ache and mild pain when I move. I had to be careful and sit in one position, which was the best, yet even that was hell. That was just the physical. It was an emotional hell too. Why do I have these? For fuck's sake. Story 116. Inner ear infection. I begged God to either make the pain stop or let me die. I'm really sorry you're feeling so much pain and hopelessness. Are you safe right now? If you were thinking about harming yourself or are in immediate danger, please call your local emergency number or, if you are in the United States, call or text 988 to reach the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. If you can, consider reaching out to someone you trust or a healthcare professional for help. I can help you find local resources or crisis numbers. Would you like me to do that? Story 117. For me personally, I have ulcerative colitis. When it was first discovered, I had to experiment with what I could and could not eat, since it is different for each person. One day I ate lasagna, and about 15 minutes later I was on the toilet crying from the intestinal pain. It was so bad I was beating my leg just to feel pain somewhere else to distract me from the pain in my intestines. Afterwards I huddled in a ball for about 10 minutes, shivering and sniffling from the ordeal. I would not wish it on anyone. Story 118. I dislocated my ankle, broke bones, and tore major ligaments. I was simply walking, stepped down from a curb, and put my foot the wrong way. My talus popped out of place and I sustained suspected fractures in the side of my foot and in the longer toe bones. The injury completely tore major ligaments from my foot up into my calf. I was an elite gymnast throughout my childhood and had no previous ankle injuries. I have had multiple broken bones and torn ligaments in other places, and I continued gymnastics into adulthood, but this injury completely stopped all physical activity for almost a year. I never had surgery because ankle outcomes are unpredictable and I thought physical therapy would be sufficient, but my ankle has never been the same. Story 119. I walked smack into a trailer hitch. I felt my soul leave my body. Story 120. I wrecked my all-terrain vehicle going down a steep hill. I hit the front brakes, not realizing it was going to flip forward with me. It threw me about 10 feet to the bottom of the hill onto my stomach, and before I could even register what was happening, the Honda Rancher ES350 four-wheel drive crushed the rear utility rack onto my hip. It shattered my hip instantly. On the video you could hear my bone crack. It sounded like a large limb breaking off a tree. I was so deep in the woods I had to wait over an hour for my friend to return with paramedics. I lay there for a whole hour, feeling aches, pins and needles, and what felt like electricity running through my leg. I was lying face down in the damp dirt, chewing mud I could reach with my mouth to try to make the pain slow down a little. Probably similar to what a woman experiences during childbirth. Story 121. Unmedicated childbirth not by choice. There was no time. Story 122. I had an abscessed tooth. I have not had any pain like that since. Thank God. Story 123. It was a toothache. I am not kidding. I was biting a shower head. Story 124. Normally I'd say my appendix rupturing was the worst, but anyone who experiences severe migraines can attest to the extreme pain. It's like God is hitting your reset switch. Story 125. I have seen this question asked a million times this week. Story 126. It is hard for me to say. More than 35 years of on and off physical torture would be difficult to compare with the others. It was probably the abuse I experienced when I was a toddler. Story 127. Sa panganganak, literal na napadasal ako na kunin na lang ako ng Lord. Story 128. When I woke up earlier than expected from my double mastectomy, also known as top surgery, they had not yet administered pain medication through my intravenous line. I could hardly speak and could not stop crying. I kept dry heaving from the pain and would have vomited if I had had anything in my stomach. Every breath was excruciating. I wanted them to sedate me again until the pain medication entered my system. When it finally started to work, the pain was still about 7 out of 10. As they wheeled me to the car, a nurse helped me into it. She put her arms under my armpits to lower me and pressed her forearms against my fresh incisions. I yelled for her to let go and let me do it myself, and I cried for the nearly 2-hour drive home from how much it hurt. It was not a pleasant experience, but I am glad I do not have to do it again. Story 129. I had my broken arm set into place. Kidney stones were awful too. Story 130. In 2007, I suffered second-degree frostbite on my feet. In 2011, I was outside too long wearing socks that were not thick enough, and because of my previous cold weather injury, I quickly developed frost nip. The rewarming of my feet that second time was the worst pain I have ever felt. I have serious orthopedic issues and am scheduled for a second neck surgery before the end of the year. Story 131. I broke my collarbone. I spent 10 days in intense pain, even though I received strong morphine. It did not help at all. Story 132. After my first baby, the shifting of muscles during childbirth pulled my left sciatic nerve slightly out of position a few weeks later. It ended up where the muscles usually used for urination and defecation were squeezing the nerve. The pain caused the muscles to tense more and it snowballed, eventually putting me in the emergency room when I could no longer empty my bowels or bladder properly because of the pain. Opioid-based painkillers in the emergency room did not touch the pain. I only got relief after they put me on a magnesium drip to control my blood pressure, which had become extremely high because of the pain, because magnesium is a muscle relaxant. After I was released, stretching the muscles helped ease the nerve back into place. I had an epidural, so maybe giving birth without painkillers would have been better, but to this day that is the worst pain I have experienced, a 12 out of 10 at its worst. Story 133. When I was 21, I had surgery on my left knee after a sports accident. I was in a leg plaster cast for 10 months. When the cast was removed, I noticed my left knee was red and extremely swollen. My physiotherapist said it was fine. Later that night, I felt a pain I will never forget. Felt as if my whole leg was coming off. I hobbled to the landing and screamed. My mother came out and saw blood everywhere. She fainted and my father rushed in. He turned white, grabbed a towel, wrapped my leg, and called an ambulance. I was rushed back to the hospital for emergency surgery. I spent another 11 months in a cast and had blood-thinning injections for a year. They found I had a blood clot. Had I had stitches instead of staples, I might not be here today. The treatment saved my life, but my athletic career was over. Story 134. The worst physical pain I experienced overall was an infected tooth. The hole in the tooth was large enough to fit a headphone jack. The most severe pain I have ever felt was an aneurysm. It truly has no comparison. It was, unfortunately, a very unique experience. Story 135. I landed from a jump and my leg hyperextended to about 90 degrees, snapping my anterior cruciate ligament instantly. It was the worst pain I have ever felt for about 30 seconds. Then it subsided until I tried to walk it off. Story 136. A 250-pound marble-top table fell and struck my lower right calf. In the end, my Achilles tendon was shredded and protruding from my leg. The worst part was not the injury itself, but when they had to clean it. Story 137. I was oddly blocked during a football game. I rolled off the football field. I got to a bench with help. I spent some time lying there, then sat up and did a sideline 15-yard sprint, stopped and asked for help. I tore my meniscus and my anterior cruciate ligament. Story 138. Right after my knee replacement surgery, they tried oxycodone, fentanyl, and 4 milligrams of hydromorphone. Nothing worked, and they had given me so many medications that they had to wait to give me more. I was in so much pain I could barely speak to ask for additional medication. They finally settled on 8 milligrams of hydromorphone every 4 hours. I will not have the other knee replaced. Story 139. I experienced a ruptured brain aneurysm. The pain caused me to go blind at the time. Story 140. When I was little, I was playing with the door hinges and my mom did not see me. After an argument, she walked past and slammed the door. 4 of my fingers got crushed. I screamed, frozen in place, and they wrapped a wet cloth around my hand as we rushed to the hospital in the car. My nails were hanging off. By the time we arrived, my hand felt numb but was pulsing. The doctor asked me to show him, and I showed it. They surgically glued my nails back on, and I wore a pink cast. Story 141. I crashed my motorcycle and broke a couple of bones. The worst part was the positive feedback loop of pain and adrenaline. I broke my collarbone in 2 places, and when the adrenaline was kicking in and wearing off, I started to shake like a leaf in a hurricane. The shaking mashed the broken collarbone against the surrounding flesh, increasing pain and adrenaline until I got painkillers from the paramedic. All I could feel was the pain and the hope that my recently ex-girlfriend would return the phone call I had made while I could still briefly stand. I locked the front brake of my motorcycle and was thrown over the bars. I shattered my ankle and pushed some bone out the side, then picked myself up and ran to the grass at the side of the road. I threw myself onto the grass and landed right on top of an ant nest. The ants bit me badly. Story 142. A complicated physical condition left me unable to support my head and neck properly for many years. I began wearing down the discs at the top of my spine and developed bone spurs. Eventually, it felt like a giant abscess tooth deep at the base of my skull. The doctors apparently did not think it could hurt that much, so I could not get help with medications. I was hauling freight at the time, and for most of each shift I would shake and sweat from the pain. I developed a dissociative disorder. I would not recommend it. Story 143. Gout. I have never experienced such intense, searing pain. Story 144. Who knew a simple tooth could cause the worst pain ever? Story 145. It wasn't fracturing my femur while playing running back that was the worst. It was the few occasions weeks later in the hospital. For a month, I lay in bed with the pieces of my broken femur held together by a single pin, which was solidly attached to a frame above me. The rest of my leg was suspended on a sling. After a few weeks of my leg hanging stationary, I awoke in the night screaming. My quadriceps were spasming so violently that they dislodged everything holding my leg in the air except the pin. Story 146. I have had kidney stones. I have been through labor a few times, twice naturally. The pain does not compare. I thought I was dying. Story 147. 2 years ago, I fell off a roof and broke 3 ribs and punctured a lung. That was the worst pain I have ever experienced. although I did manage to drive myself to the hospital. Story 148. I lost my best friend when he was 21. He had a heart attack and died in my arms. The funeral was an even bigger heartbreak. I have never been to anyone else's funeral, not even my mother's. Story 149. It is either dry socket after all 4 wisdom teeth were extracted at the same time or recovery from spinal surgery. Story 150. The worst pain I have ever felt happened just last week. It was a 4-hour intercostal and paraspinal spasm that locked my entire thoracic cage. One of my mid-back ribs around thoracic vertebrae 8 to 9 had partially subluxed, trapping an intercostal nerve where it runs between the rib and the spine. The trapped nerve set off a chain reaction. The paraspinal and intercostal muscles seized in a protective spasm, and the diaphragm joined in, trying to brace against the pain. It became a full-body thoracic lock. I could not sit, lie down, or breathe properly. Every breath felt like being impaled through the back. It was like my chest was wrapped in barbed wire and was slowly being tightened. My heart rate was over 180 beats per minute and stayed there for half an hour. I was moaning uncontrollably and pacing because standing still made it worse. The staff tried to get me onto a bed, but when I tried to sit, I screamed. They could not grasp how extreme it was. It only released when they told me I needed to be still so they could put in a cannula. I told them I would have to vocalize and scream because I needed a way to discharge the severity of the pain. When I threw my head back and let the scream out, I felt the displaced rib slide back into place. After 4 hours of unrelenting body-locking pain, it stopped in a few seconds. Afterward, I was so weak I could barely hold my phone. I tried to show the doctor my Dexcom reading. My blood sugar level had dropped to 3.4 during the episode, but I was so weak I could not lift my phone. I had to use 2 hands to lift it for just a second. For the next 12 hours, my whole back just burned. It was the most extraordinary relief, pure, overwhelming euphoria after being pinned in agony for so long. I have had moments like that before, but nothing even close to this intensity. For comparison, I once had a hip replacement where the spinal block and ketamine drip both failed, basically major surgery with no pain relief, and even that was nothing compared to this. The combination of the rib, intercostal nerve, paraspinal spasm, and diaphragmatic involvement was beyond excruciating. A perfect storm of nerve entrapment and reflex contraction that pushed my body to its absolute limit. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.